The heat scorches your face. You're choking on smoke. All around you, fire. Not just any fire, but a blaze consuming time itself. Scrolls crackle like dry twigs underfoot. Each snap a lost theorem, a vanished map, the silent lament of an ancient astronomer. You think, this is the end. Julius Caesar set the port ablaze, and with the ships, the library ignited. The entire world of knowledge, reduced to ashes. Your heart sinks. Your palms sweat. You can already see humanity plunging into 1,000 years of darkness. But what if I told you? None of this happened. There was a fire, yes, but not there. Not then, and not like that. The main collection of the library was housed in the Mausoleon, the very heart of Alexandria, far from the port warehouses. What burned in 48 BCE was likely just a batch of duplicate scrolls, rolled up for sale. Can you imagine? For 300 years, we believed in an apocalypse, and it was just a warehouse fire. The library lived on. It was read. It was written in, for another 3 centuries. Do you know that feeling, when fear speaks louder than truth? It's the same here. Later, under the Romans, knowledge wasn't burned. It was simply defunded. Emperors stopped paying for parchment. Scholars left. Scrolls gathered dust. Then came the Christians. Then the Muslims. And each new ruler of the city believed, foreign wisdom is a threat. But even then, knowledge didn't disappear. It moved. To Byzantium. To Antioch. To the House of Wisdom in Baghdad. You think Hypatia died and everything was lost? No. Her books were being read in Samarkand 200 years later. And here's where it gets interesting. The real tragedy isn't the fire, it's how we turned a slow decline into a Hollywood explosion. Why? Because catastrophe is simpler than truth. Because it's easier to blame Caesar than to admit we ourselves abandoned knowledge. But knowledge isn't a thing. It doesn't burn. It migrates. It hides. It waits. And it returns when it finds those ready to hear it. Remember this moment. The library didn't burn down. It just changed its address. Imagine you are Callimachus of Cyrene, a poet, a pedant, a genius. You're summoned to Alexandria by Ptolemy II, and you step into the Mausoleon and freeze. Chaos surrounds you. Scrolls in piles like laundry after a wild night. Homer next to recipes for scabies. Astronomical tables under someone's half-eaten fish. You think, this isn't a library. It's a dump for smart people. And then you do the impossible. You pick up a pen and you start writing Pina keys. This isn't just a catalog. It's the first search engine in human history. 120 wooden tablets, 49,000 entries. Each author with a biography, a list of works, notes on forgeries. You don't just store knowledge, you index it, you verify it, you link it. It's a knowledge machine without electricity, but with a logic that would make Google's servers tremble. Do you know that feeling, when you have everything but can't find anything? Callimachus killed it. He turned chaos into a system, and he made the library alive. Because here, they didn't just read, they worked. Ships in the port were searched, scrolls confiscated, scribes copied. The original stayed in Alexandria. The copy returned to its owner. Honest? No. Effective? Insanely so. It was the first global operation of knowledge theft for good purposes, and it all worked. Eratosthenes calculated the Earth's circumference with 2% accuracy, simply by measuring a shadow in 2 cities. Herophilus dissected corpses and described nerves like wires in a wall. Scholars lived at the Museum, argued over dinner, wrote comments in the margins like on TikTok, only on papyrus. This wasn't a museum. It was a factory of the mind, state-funded, like a nuclear program. But instead of bombs, books. But here's the paradox that baffles the mind. With all this, they invented almost nothing. They knew levers. They didn't build cranes. They understood steam. They didn't make a machine. Why? Because knowledge was like a trophy on a shelf to them. Beautiful, respected, useless. They didn't believe that the mind should change reality. Science, for glory, not for practical use. And so the library, despite all its power, remained a temple, not an engine. They had everything, except the desire to apply it. Therefore, its loss didn't set humanity back 1,000 years. Because there was no progress to begin with, no inertia to interrupt, no technologies to forget. There was magnificent, fragile, impotent knowledge, like a diamond in an empty room. And when the Ptolemies stopped paying, when the Romans stopped believing, when the Christians stopped tolerating, the system simply crumbled. Not from fire, from indifference. Look at this. The library fell not because it was burned, but because people stopped believing in it. And that is the real tragedy. Not for history, but for us, because we still confuse gathering knowledge with using it. Port of Alexandria, 48th year BCE. You hear a crackle, not of wood, not of pitch. It's scrolls burning. Caesar is in a panic. His ships are trapped. He sets fire to the fleet to cut off the enemy. The flames leap to the warehouses, among sacks of wheat, wooden crates. Inside, copies of Homer, dialogues, maps, not originals, not the treasure of the Mauseon, just merchandise. But you already see the apocalypse. Your heart sinks. You think, this is the end of the world. Now, the fact. Strabo arrives in Alexandria 30 years later. He walks through the Mauseon, describes the library, alive, working, with scholars at tables, with papyri on shelves, no ashes, no silence. The main collection, in the city center, far from the port. The fire didn't reach it. The library was reading, writing, arguing for another 300 years. But why then does Plutarch write that Caesar burned all the books? Ammianus Marcellinus, that the wisdom of the world was lost. Because the brain loves drama. It needs a villain, one person, one order, one bonfire. Easier than admitting knowledge dies not from fire, but from lack of funding, indifference, the changing of eras. The myth arose not from facts, but from a need to find someone to blame for the fall of the ancient world. Imagine you are a medieval monk, rewriting history. You need to explain why Rome fell. You take Caesar's story and inflate it like a balloon, add details, double the losses, turn a warehouse fire into a cosmic tragedy. And then Edward Gibbon takes this version and cements it into textbooks for 200 years. And now you believe Caesar destroyed science with a single stroke. But the truth is more modest. Caesar most likely didn't even know there were scrolls in the warehouses. He was thinking about war, not philosophy, and certainly didn't intend to erase knowledge from the face of the earth. He was simply burning tactical space, like any general trapped, and we turned him into a murderer of enlightenment. Do you know that feeling, when the one you blame isn't actually guilty? It's the same here. The true end came later, not from a Roman sword, not from an accidental flame. It came when faith became a weapon, when pagan temples became targets. And then, 400 years after Caesar, fire erupted in Alexandria, not chaotic, but sacred. A fire lit not by a general, but by a saint. And this fire left no chances. 391 CE. You stand on a street in Alexandria. The air smells of pitch, sweat, and fear. A crowd rolls toward the hill like an avalanche. At the front, Patriarch Theophilus, white vestments, a cross in his hand, not a symbol, but a battering ram. The target, the Serapeum, a temple fortress, the last stronghold of the pagans. But you know the truth, inside are not just statues. There are books, not just scrolls, but the memory of the world, laid out in cedar chests, each with a ceramic tag, name, topic, date, like a stamp on knowledge's passport. The crowd bursts in, clubs smash marble columns, torches fly into the halls, flames seize papyrus, and it flares yellow, greasy, greedy. Do you hear the crackle? That's not wood. That's Aristotle. That's Eratosthenes. That's maps that led to the stars. And the tags? They're not burned. They're collected later, carefully, gently, and taken to kilns, melted down into lime, for the walls of new churches. Even the memory of knowledge becomes building material. Do you know that feeling, when not only the truth, but even a hint of it, is erased? The Serapeum wasn't a mere storage facility. It became a library when the main collection of the Museion was exhausted. What still breathed was moved here: astronomical tables, medical treatises, commentaries on Plato. Its destruction wasn't a fire. It was a declaration. Emperor Theodosius I signed a decree. Doubt is a crime. Reason is heresy. And faith is law. As Socrates Scholasticus wrote, the temple fell, and with it all pagan wisdom. But he was wrong. Wisdom didn't fall. It was murdered. The most terrifying thing isn't the fire, not the mob, but the fact that after the ashes, not even a list remained. You won't know what burned. Originals, copies, the works of Hypatia the Elder, Aristarchus's drafts. Archaeologists find fragments of tags, smooth, scorched, speechless. Without context, they are just clay. Imagine you burn a library, and then you erase the catalog. You don't just kill knowledge, you kill the very possibility of mourning it. But listen to this. Even in this hell, reason didn't surrender. It retreated into the shadows, into narrow alleys, into dusty chests, into monastic cells. Somewhere in a corner, a woman reads Plato aloud. Not whispering, but clearly, loudly, in the square. Her name is Hypatia, and as long as she speaks, knowledge lives. It's not in the walls, not in the scrolls. It's in the voice, in the question, in the courage to look into the darkness and not be silent. March, 415 CE, Alexandria. You walk down the street and feel the air is thick like pitch, not dust, not heat. Fear. Hypatia returns from a lecture, in a chariot, in white, with ink on her fingers and a question on her lips. She doesn't hide, doesn't whisper. She speaks, loudly, clearly, as if the world still listens. But the world no longer listens. At the church of the Caesareum, a crowd, not people, rabble, with empty eyes and full fists. They drag her from the carriage, haul her over the cobblestones, not with a sword, not with a knife, with potsherds, fragments of earthenware, sharp, jagged. They pierce her flesh, slowly, cruelly, as if they were cutting not the body, but the idea itself. Then, a bonfire, ashes, silence. You think they killed her for the library? No. By 415 CE, the library was almost gone. The archives are silent. Scrolls, less than 10% of their peak. But Hypatia isn't a repository. She's a living processor. Philosophy in motion, mathematics with a pulse, astronomy with a voice. They killed her not for books, for the right to ask questions, in a city where only answers remained. As her student Synesius wrote, she was the voice of reason in a city that no longer wished to hear. Do you know that feeling, when you're not killed for what you've done, but for what you might think? It's the same here. Patriarch Cyril didn't shout, "Burn the books." He whispered, "Burn doubt." And the crowd believed reason is a threat, dialogue is heresy, and a woman who teaches men logic is a sorceress. But here's the paradox. While her body burned, her knowledge traveled. Students fled to Athens, to Antioch, to Constantinople. In their chests, not gold, scrolls, drafts, formulas, star charts. More than 70% of the key texts had already been copied, not saved, relocated. Remember this moment. Hypatia died not for the library. She died for the right to think, and that right didn't burn. It migrated to Baghdad, 400 years later, in the House of Wisdom, where Arab scholars would translate 300 Greek works, including those Europe had forgotten forever. Aristotle, Galen, Eratosthenes. All of them would return, through ashes, across seas, through centuries, to ignite the Renaissance. So Hypatia's death isn't an end. It's a reboot. Humanity didn't regress 1,000 years. It just changed servers. Look at this. The murder of reason in Alexandria became the birth of reason elsewhere. Because knowledge isn't a thing, it's a virus. And if you don't kill it completely, It mutates, spreads, triumphs, even when it's burned, even when it's silenced, especially when it's silenced. Night, Alexandria, 415 CE. You feel the air is thick with fear and soot. Lanterns flicker. In the shadow of the columns, trembling silhouettes. One of them clutches a wooden box to his chest. Inside, not gold, scrolls, Euclid's works, Hipparchus's drafts, commentaries on Archimedes. His cloak smells of sweat and the dust of the desert he's fleeing to. Eastward, across rivers where every ferryman is an informant, across borders where Latin no longer saves. His destination, Edessa or Antioch. They still read Greek there, not as the language of pagans, but as the language of reason. He's not fleeing. He's evacuating knowledge, like a soldier, a wounded comrade. You think, is this the end? No. This is a redeployment of reserves. Do you know that feeling when you're saving not a thing but the future? Well, by 401 CE, less than 10% of the scrolls remained in Alexandria, but 70% of the key texts already lived in other cities. Byzantine monasteries, Syrian schools, Nisibis, Edessa. There, monks didn't just pray. They copied, translated into Syriac, wrote in the margins, not prayers but clarifications. The system worked like a cloud before the internet. Each scriptorium, a server, each copyist, a network node. Without them, there would be no Albertus Magnus, no Bacon, no Renaissance. You think knowledge dies in fire? No, it migrates, like a refugee with documents in their lining. And here's the twist. What if almost everything important survived? Yes, duplicates burned in the port. Yes, the Serapeum was burned. Yes, Hypatia was killed. But what was valued survived. Astronomy, logic, medicine. Because they were copied, not out of nostalgia, out of necessity. And what disappeared didn't disappear from fire, from indifference. Ancient scholars didn't build machines. They were content with glory. Therefore, even with all the texts, they didn't produce a steam engine. The loss was partial, but the myth made it total, convenient, dramatic. To blame Caesar, rather than admit we ourselves abandoned knowledge until it became useful. Look here, knowledge didn't die. It emigrated. First, to Byzantium, then, further east, to where Greek letters were read not as heresy, but as truth. To Baghdad, a city where, in the 9th century, the House of Wisdom was opened. They didn't just store it there, they added to it. Algebra to geometry, experience to theory, observation to dogma. You think Europe recovered antiquity on its own? No, it got it back, through Arabic translation, through those who weren't afraid to ask. So the ashes of Alexandria weren't the end. They became fertile ground for a new tree, which grew not in the west, but in the east, and only then returned home. Baghdad, 830 CE. You walk down the street and hear not the cries of merchants, but the rustle of parchment. In a garden where oranges smell like hope stands a building. Inside, lamps burn day and night. This is not a temple, not a palace. This is the house of wisdom. And before you, Hunayn ibn Ishaq, a Christian, a Syrian. He speaks Greek like an Athenian, Arabic like a caliph. In his hands, a scroll of Galen, cracked, moldy, brought from Edessa in a sack with hardtack. He doesn't translate, he resurrects. Every word, like a stitch on the wound of civilization. And for this, the caliph pays him his weight in gold, annually. You think the Arabs only waged war? What if they were reading what Europe had forgotten forever? By 850 CE, over 300 Greek works had been translated in Baghdad, not just copied, improved. Apollonius's conics became the basis of optics. Aristotle's Meteorologica laid the foundation for meteorology. Galen? His texts formed the Canon of Medicine by Ibn Sina, a textbook for Europe for 500 years. They didn't just preserve knowledge, they infected it with new logic. Greek geometry plus Indian numerals, and there you have algebra. Astronomy plus observations, and you get an astrolabe, more accurate than any Roman instrument. Do you know that feeling when salvation comes from an unexpected place? You believe the Renaissance began in Florence? What if it began in Baghdad, 300 years earlier? Because when Europe discovered Aristotle in the 12th century, it wasn't reading the Greek original. It wasn't there. It was reading an Arabic translation, with commentaries, with corrections, with additions. Thomas Aquinas quoted Avicenna as a god of science, and Avicenna is Ibn Sina, who read Galen in Hunayn's translation. Without Baghdad, there would be no University of Paris. Without Toledo, there would be no Dante. The chain didn't break, it just bent, eastward. But why have we forgotten Baghdad? Why do textbooks only mention the fire in Alexandria, and not the lamps in the House of Wisdom? Because 19th century Europe didn't want to believe. Salvation came from outsiders, from those they called barbarians. It's easier to weep over a myth than to thank an enemy. The myth of the burned library became a comfort. It said, "We are not to blame. We were deprived of knowledge." But the truth is harsher. You abandoned it, and others picked it up, extracted its meaning, and returned it as a debt. Look here. Knowledge does not die. It seeks hands that are not afraid to hold it. In Baghdad, they were not afraid of it. And so Antiquity did not perish. It rebooted, in another language, under another sky, with another heart. And when Europe finally reached out, it was given not ashes, but seeds, which grew into the Renaissance. So next time you hear about the 1,000 years of darkness, smile. There was no darkness. There was just a pause, while reason waited to be called by name. Again. London, 1776. You sit in a room that smells of old ink and self-satisfaction. Before you, Edward Gibbon, wig, quill, and absolute certainty that Christians burned the Library of Alexandria to the ground. He doesn't check archives, doesn't delve into sources. He takes a late chronicler, Socrates Scholasticus, and turns a rumor into history. Why? Because he needs an enemy. Clear, evil, fanatical. To explain the fall of Rome not by corruption, not by wars, not by economics, but by the darkness of faith engulfing the light of reason. And so, the myth gets a passport, stamped in gold, in the most influential work of the era. You think, so what? It's just a book. But no, this is a code. From this moment on, every schoolchild, every philosopher, every European will know knowledge perished at the hand of the cross, not from lack of funds, not from indifference, from holy fire. And this version fits perfectly into the 19th century colonial narrative. We are the heirs of antiquity. They are the barbarians who destroyed enlightenment. Convenient? Absolutely. You're not to blame that science left. It was stolen from you. You're a victim, not those who left scrolls to gather dust until they were needed for steam engines. But look here. While you mourned the fire, knowledge migrated. Byzantine monks copied Galen in Syriac. Arab scholars in Baghdad not only read Aristotle, they improved him. Ibn al-Haytham invented optics that Europe wouldn't replicate for another 600 years. Al-Khwarizmi created algebra, and you still pronounce his name when solving an equation. But they were erased from history, not burned, just not mentioned. Because myth demands a clean line. Athens, Rome, Florence. Without Baghdad, without Edessa, without those who carried knowledge in sacks with hardtack. Do you know that feeling, when you believe in a tragedy so you don't have to see salvation? We mourned the ashes so we wouldn't have to thank those who carried the books from the fire. For to admit that Islamic civilization preserved and developed antiquity means to admit enlightenment isn't only ours. And then the entire hierarchy crumbles, the entire idea of Western exceptionalism. It's easier to blame Caesar or Cyril than to thank Hunayn ibn Ishaq, who translated Galen for his weight in gold. And here's the key point. The myth of the burned library isn't a mistake. It's a trauma that Europe turned into an excuse. You think the Renaissance began with Dante? No. It began with Arabic translation. But we forgot. Because memory is also power. And as long as you believe that everything burned you don't notice, knowledge didn't disappear. It simply changed hands. And then it returned. Not as a gift, as a debt. So next time you hear about the 1,000 years of darkness, ask, whose darkness? And whose light are you not noticing? What actually burned in Alexandria? Not books, not knowledge. What burned was the illusion that reason itself is immortal. You think the library fell from fire? No. It withered when it ceased to be needed, when they stopped paying for ink, when scholars left and their places were taken by preachers. It wasn't an explosion. It was a sigh, long, quiet, like a dying bonfire without fuel. But while the flame died in Alexandria, a new one ignited in other cities. Imagine a chain, not of gold, of names. Callimachus of Cyrene, the first to bring order to the chaos of knowledge. Hypatia, the last to read Plato aloud in a square where no one listened anymore. Then, nameless monks in Edessa, whose fingers trembled not from fear, but from the cold in their cells, where they copied Galen under the rumble of enemy cavalry. And finally, Hunayn ibn Ishaq in Baghdad, who not only translated but brought texts back to life, turning mold on papyrus into formulas for the future. You no longer see a catastrophe. You see a relay race. And every hand in this chain is stronger than any fire. But this is what is erased from memory. Not the scrolls, but those who saved them. You were taught to fear Caesar, who perhaps didn't even know he was burning books. You were made to hate Theophilus, who burned the Serapeum. But you don't know the names of those who carried scrolls in sacks with hardtack across the desert. You don't know how Syrian schoolchildren learned logic to the clatter of chains. You haven't heard how Arab scholars argued about geometry until dawn. They were erased, not by fire, by silence, because myth needs an enemy, not a hero in a torn cloak with a box on his shoulder. And here's the final twist. The most valuable thing that disappeared in Alexandria was gratitude. Gratitude to those who didn't let knowledge die. We remember the ashes, but we forgot the hands that carried the seeds from it. And in this is our own blindness. You think the Renaissance was born on its own? No. It was born in Baghdad, nurtured in Byzantium, carried to Toledo. But history loves clean lines. Athens, Rome, Florence, without the East, without foreign names, without debts. So was the loss a catastrophe? Or was it an act of survival? Slow, stubborn, human. Think about it. Your answer determines the future. If you believe that knowledge is a fragile flame, you will fear every wind. But if you see it as a river, you will understand. It will always find a way, even through ashes, even through silence. And then your task is not to mourn the past, but to become the next link, because the chain doesn't break, as long as someone remembers and passes it on. You are already in it. Decide what name you will leave.